And we will dive now into the endocrine system. Unlike the nervous system, which took us several weeks to get through, we only have 8 slides total for the endocrine system. Does that mean that the endocrine system is not as important? No, it is obviously very important. It's the other major system that helps us regulate the entire rest of the body, but structurally there's just not as much craziness to discuss, so it's not as hard to get through and time consuming. If we think back to the beginning of the semester, we talked a lot about glands in our first unit. And that's what makes up your endocrine system, a series of glands that produce hormones. And we'll be talking a lot about hormones in this lecture, not quite as much as what I get into in this lecture for physiology, but we will discuss them nonetheless. So, reading through the endocrine system, along with the nervous system, acts to coordinate the functions of all body systems. In other words, these two systems, the nervous system that we just got done talking about and the endocrine system that we are talking about here, they're in charge of everything else. They're most in charge of maintaining what we call homeostasis. Okay? Your endocrine system consists of glands that regulate body activities. And if we think back to that beginning part of the semester in Unit 1, we learned that there are 2 types of glands found in the human body, exocrine and endocrine. Okay, exocrine are the ones that we talk more about at that point. Those would be like the glands in your ears that I was just mentioning, called ceruminous glands, but also glands like in your skin that produce sweat or oil, or glands internally, like within the walls of the stomach, that secrete your digestive juices. Okay. Key feature of exocrine glands is that they have a duct, which is like a tube that carries the secretion out of the glands, either into the lumen of a body cavity, like into the inside of the stomach, or into the case of like your sweat and oil glands to the surface of the skin. Endocrine glands do not have a duct, okay, and their product is always going to be chemicals called hormones that are released into the interstitial fluid, which is just the fluid that surrounds the cells that do the secreting. From there, most of the time, the hormones diffuse from the interstitial fluid into the blood capillaries, where they are then transported to target cells throughout the body. Okay. 2 types of endocrine glands are found throughout the body: those that are wholly endocrine in function, and those that have other functions as well. So, in other words, if they are wholly endocrine in function, that means their job is strictly to produce hormones. They have no other job other than to produce at least one, in many cases, several hormones. This set of organs or glands that are wholly endocrine in function include both parts of the pituitary, your singular thyroid, the 4 parathyroid glands, a pair of adrenals, so there's 2 of those, and then 1 pineal gland, which, if you think back just a couple of class periods ago, we kind of mentioned a little bit about the pituitary and the pineal gland because those are up there in the brain or connected to it. Okay, and we're going to see those again here in this lecture. Okay, then you've got these other organs which typically have a job that is not related to the production of hormones, but since they produce a hormone, that makes them a component of the endocrine system. That includes the hypothalamus that we talked a lot about the other day in our brain lecture. We'll look at it again here in just a couple of slides. Your thymus, which is predominantly built for lymphatic and immune response processes. We'll get into that one just briefly here. Pancreas, which is about 99% built for digestive purposes, but there are 1% of the cells that produce hormones. Then you got the ovaries in females, the testes in men, obviously very involved with reproductive processes. Okay. You got the kidneys, the stomach, the liver, the small intestine, the skin, the heart, adipose tissue, and the placenta. And I read through those really quickly because we're really not going to talk about those structures at this point in time. And we will, though, talk about the hypothalamus, the thymus, the pancreas, the ovaries, and the testes in this lecture. And now, some of those other things that I just kind of glanced through, we have yet to talk about. So, like, we will talk about the stomach, the liver, and the small intestine when we get to the digestive system. We'll talk about the kidneys here in a couple of weeks when we talk about the urinary system. We've already talked about the skin. We'll talk about the heart here in about a week. And then these last two, we don't really talk too much about them, but they do produce hormones. And that's why they are considered a component of the endocrine system. Now, together, the actions of the nervous and endocrine systems can basically be described as what we would call the neuroendocrine system. It describes the cooperation of these two systems in order to perform general functions of communication, integration, and control. So don't think of them as two separate entities, but two entities that work together towards that same goal, which, there's kind of three major things: communication, integration, and just control of the body. Okay. Once again, your endocrine system is composed of secreting cells, sending hormone molecules via the bloodstream to specific target cells contained in target tissues or target organs. Okay. A hormone can be described as a mediator molecule released in one part of the body but regulates activity of cells in other parts of the body. In order for those hormones to have a response or produce a response in those target cells, the target cells must be able to accept and receive those hormones. And so target cells need to have specific receptors for these different hormones. In other words, for example, your thyroid gland is able to accept and be acted upon by a hormone that is released up in our brain called thyroid stimulating hormone. Thyroid stimulating hormone is going to stimulate the thyroid. Your thyroid gland has the receptors for that hormone. All the other organs of the body are not going to have the same receptors that the thyroid gland would have for that hormone. And it's all about the shape of both the hormone and the receptors. Think of the relationship between hormones and the receptors like the relationship that exists between a lock and a key. Okay? Keys have specific shapes, and that determines whether they can fit in a door lock, right? And you can't just expect your car key to unlock your house because it's not structurally built in order to fit together. Okay, so that's what produces this selectivity between the hormones and the receptors. And we're talking about a whole bunch of hormones that our body produces. Are we going to talk about all 50 plus of them in this class? Absolutely not. We'll kind of focus in on a very small fraction of that. Okay. So how is that relationship like a lock and a key? Once again, it's all about shape. So target cells contain highly specific receptors, which are going to be proteins or glycoproteins on the surface of the cells, or in other words, on the plasma membrane. And then the geometry of the molecules allows only for very specific hormones to attach the receptor or to the receptor in the target cell surface. Okay, looking at this figure at the bottom, we have basically kind of a couple different views, kind of looking at the body just from an anterior view, and then here would be the back of the neck, and then this little box here would be just zoomed in at this area of the brain, showing a few things that we've seen before. I do want you to highlight some stuff. Essentially, what I want you to know over here on these this backside view, I want you to highlight the thyroid and the parathyroids. Okay. And then in this image, the adrenals, the pancreas. The top right here, the three things up in there in the brain: the pineal gland, hypothalamus, pituitary, and the throat, the thyroid. Not to be confused with the thymus. I do want you to know the thymus. Very easy, just because their names sound very similar. Thyroid's in the throat, thymus sits on the heart. Okay. You don't need to know the heart. And then I want you to know the ovary that's labeled, and then the testes that are labeled at the bottom. Now keep in mind, obviously, if we're dealing with a man, they're going to have testes, so they're showing them there down in the scrotum. If this was a female, there would be no scrotum nor any testes, and the structure is located right here, would be right here in this yellow box, which includes two ovaries. Only one of them is labeled, the fallopian tubes and the uterus, although the fallopian tubes and the uterus, I'm not going to have you worry about those because they're not endocrine in function. They don't produce hormones. And one thing I want to note, if I zoom in, you can kind of see what they've done. They've just drawn some dotted lines with the shape of the pancreas. Okay, you would not be able to see the pancreas, nor would you be able to see the kidneys, the adrenal glands, or a lot of other structures unless basically most of the intestines are removed. It really is misleading in this picture because it looks like the small intestine is all that's it. That's not at all the case. Your small intestines, they're like, I don't want to say like 20 feet long, and they're coiled up and they're basically all over your abdomen. And then not even included in this picture is a large intestine. And so these organs would be covered up. So that's why they've kind of outlined where the pancreas would be. It's actually way behind your stomach, kind of covered up by the liver as well. Same thing for the adrenal glands. So it's not a perfect image to show you what it would really look like deep to the skin, but it's their best attempt anyway to show it. Now, since we've been talking about the nervous system here for the last few weeks, thought it'd be a good idea to kind of transition away from that by kind of talking about some things that are similar and then some things that are different between the nervous system and the endocrine system. And then after this, we can finally move on and focus in on endocrine stuff. All right, so recalling from previous lectures, two main systems in the body responsible for maintaining homeostasis in the nervous and endocrine systems. I've already said that a couple times. These two systems are similar in several ways, but also are different in their own ways as well. Okay, but keep in mind, once again, they work in a coordinated manner, so they're not working as separate entities, but as a kind of functional group together in order to maintain that homeostasis. Okay. The way that the two systems communicate is similar in one way, but also very different in another way. Okay, both the nervous and the endocrine systems use chemical messengers. In the case of the nervous system, it's chemicals called neurotransmitters. In the endocrine system, we call those chemicals hormones. And that's the only way that the endocrine system communicates, is through chemical means. But the nervous system employs both electrical and chemical means. The electrical signals that the nervous system uses are those action potentials we've talked about here for the last couple of class periods. And the nervous system is very, very quick, and it stops very quickly as well. We're dealing in milliseconds. It's not seconds, minutes, hours, days. It's almost instant. Okay? Like when you touch something hot, you feel that pain instantly. You remove your hand from it instantly because you're dealing in fractions upon fractions of a second. Okay? The endocrine system is much slower, and that's because hormone release can take seconds or even days to complete. And then those hormones can linger, and therefore the effect may continue for weeks. Okay? Think of the difference between the two systems. Like the nervous is like sending a text message where as soon as you hit send, the message is going to be received by the other individual. Whereas the endocrine system, that's like doing the old-fashioned write a letter, send it in the mail, and it has to go through the postal service to get to the recipient. Okay? That kind of leads me into the next thing, adaptation to long-term stimuli. The nervous system is going to decline really rapidly or adapt really quickly, whereas the endocrine system persists. The area effect is very targeted and specific, and that's what's illustrated here in this top illustration on the bottom. In some cases, we might be dealing with just a few individual cells or like one organ, whereas the endocrine system, by dumping those hormones into the bloodstream, those hormones can go throughout the entire body and can produce widespread effects through many organs in some cases. Okay. Now, several chemicals actually can function as both hormones and neurotransmitters. It's the same chemical, like in the case of norepinephrine. So how can it be classified as both? Well, if it's released by a neuron, what we call the sympathetic neurons, it would be a neurotransmitter. In other places of the body, what we call the adrenal medulla, these chromaffin cells release it into the bloodstream, which makes it a hormone. Okay. Now, does that mean not a hormone, or I mean a neuron can't release a hormone? No, actually, some hormones are secreted by neuroendocrine cells or neuroendocrine neurons. That includes oxytocin and the catecholamines, which we'll talk about here later in the lecture. Both systems are going to have overlapping effects on the same target cells, like in the case of norepinephrine, which is a neurotransmitter, glucagon, a hormone. Both those promote the breakdown of glycogen in the liver. And then the two systems help regulate each other. For example, neurons can trigger the secretion of hormones, and hormones can stimulate or inhibit neurons. Okay, as far as the illustration or the two pictures down there at the bottom, don't worry about those. Nothing too important to worry about. All right, like I said, at this point, we're going to now transition to talking just specifically about your endocrine organs. And that's what we're going to do, going organ by organ and discovering what they do as far as promoting homeostasis, and then obviously learning about their structural makeup. All right, the first structures we're going to talk about, we've actually discussed a little bit about before. Hypothalamus is a portion of our brain, as we've previously learned, forms the floor and the walls of our third ventricle in our brain. So it's kind of in the middle of that, what we would call diencephalon. Suspended down from it is what we call the pituitary gland, which also goes by the term in its more sophisticated hypophysis, which is where you come up with these terms adeno and neurohypophysis. Okay. Your pituitary gland is about 1 centimeter in diameter, so it's pretty small, about the size of a pea. Lies at the base of the brain in the area known as the sella turcica, which is this little indented cradle part of what we call the sphenoid bone. If you remember back, we learned about that. Sella turcica previously goes and translates to mean Turkish saddle. Okay. Connecting your pituitary to the hypothalamus is a stalk-like structure called the infundibulum, which you can see is bracketed off and labeled here. Here in the sagittally sectioned pituitary, you can also see the infundibulum, and so just above it would be the pituitary gland, or excuse me, the hypothalamus. Okay. Now, your pituitary gland is made up of two anatomically and very functionally separate structures, what we call the adeno and the neurohypophysis, or what we commonly will call them the anterior and the posterior pituitary. Okay. The anterior pituitary or adenohypophysis is actually made up of two parts. The largest is the anterior lobe, making up about 75% of it. That anterior lobe is more sophisticatedly known as the pars distalis. The other part of the adenohypophysis or the anterior pituitary is the pars tuberalis, which forms a sheath or basically like a wrapping around that infundibulum, or the what we just called stalk hanging down from the hypothalamus. Okay. A key feature of the anterior pituitary is that it has no nervous connection with the hypothalamus, which is very, very different between the hypothalamus and the posterior pituitary. And we're going to see that here in just a second. Okay. The way that the anterior pituitary and the hypothalamus is connected is a very, very unique, what we call portal blood system. Okay. This is called the hypophysioportal system, which enables hormones to flow directly from the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary before anywhere else in the body. And that's, like I said, very unique. And I'm going to explain why by just kind of essentially drawing up how this all works. There it is. Okay, Now, generally, I'm just going to kind of label it like this. General circulation route. So in order for a hormone to go from a structure to another structure, this is typically how it goes. Okay? Hormones are always going to be picked up by capillaries. Capillaries are the smallest blood vessels of the body. And this is where we always perform what we call exchange, which is where stuff is able to enter the blood or leave the blood. And so in this case, entering the blood would be a hormone. Okay. From capillaries, blood is going to flow into blood vessels known as veins. Okay. From veins, blood flows back to the heart. That's what the function of veins is, just to provide us with return of blood back to the heart. Okay. From veins, blood then flows into arteries, which are the blood vessels that carry blood away to deliver it to capillaries. Okay. So essentially, hormones get picked up in one structure, then have to get brought to the heart and then back out of the heart before they can get distributed to the body or to that organ or whatever that structure is. So it's a very indirect route. Okay. If you want to go from point A to point B, what's the easiest, most direct way to do it? A straight line, right? Okay. That's where a portal system is going to play. Or that's what a portal system enables. Okay. So I'll kind of just draw it up like this. So we'll have the same couple components here at the beginning: heart, arteries, capillaries. But instead of going directly into veins, we have a couple, or in some cases just one, unique blood vessels known as portal veins. A portal vein is going to draw blood from one capillary network and deliver it to another capillary network. And then from veins, back to the heart we go. But if we kind of just focus in on this part of my schematic here, this is going to allow blood that flows through the hypothalamus, for example, to pick up hormones, then get directly carried to the capillaries in the anterior pituitary, where those hormones can leave and interact with the anterior pituitary. So it enables direct flow between two structures. In other words, we don't have to waste time by going back to the heart and then right out, which is fantastic because look where the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary are. They're neighbors. They're essentially connected to one another thanks to that stalk. So the hormones from the hypothalamus are picked up here in what we call the primary plexus of the hypophysioportal system. Notice there's these two blood vessels right here that are going to take those hormones to that anterior pituitary. These two blood vessels are those two portal veins, what we call the hypophysioportal veins. Those hormones then get taken out of the blood thanks to the secondary plexus of the hypophysioportal system. And then they interact and do things to the anterior pituitary that either result in the anterior pituitary releasing hormones or inhibit it. Okay. There are 7 hormones that the hypothalamus produces that control the anterior pituitary. It was once thought that the anterior pituitary is the master gland, but we now know that the hypothalamus is actually in charge of it. Okay. There are, like, for example, growth hormone releasing hormone released by the hypothalamus. Growth hormone releasing hormone comes down through these blood vessels into the anterior pituitary, and it then tells the anterior pituitary to release growth hormone. That's why it's called a releasing hormone. It promotes the release of that hormone. Okay. The hypothalamus can also release growth hormone inhibiting hormone, which does exactly what its name implies. It comes down from the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary, and then it inhibits the release of growth hormone by the anterior pituitary. Okay. Those 7 hormones I'm not really going to get into. Okay, you're going to have enough to worry about, but just know that there are 7 hormones produced here that get carried here to interact with the anterior pituitary. And I'll talk a little bit more about that on the next page. Notice that there is not that same type of connection between the hypothalamus and the posterior pituitary. There are no portal blood vessels connecting here. Okay. Instead, your posterior pituitary is actually just an extension of the hypothalamus. And I'll get to that more in the next page. Okay. Your posterior pituitary and neural hypophysis is composed of neural tissue. So it's nervous. Neural or nervous is the same thing. It consists of 2 parts. The pars nervosa or posterior lobe is the larger bulbar portion. That's what this is. And then that other structure is the infundibulum that we've talked about, the stalk structure that connects the pituitary to the hypothalamus. There is a third region of the pituitary, what we call the pars intermedia, but that actually atrophies. So it like shrinks up and dies off during fetal development. So it ceases to exist as a separate lobe in adults. Some of those original cells, though, can migrate into the adjacent parts of the anterior pituitary where they persist. Okay. Between the hypothalamus and both parts of the pituitary, we secrete around or at least 16 hormones. There might be one that we don't know yet, but we know of at least 16 hormones that help to regulate things like stress, rage, flight, body temperature, thirst, hunger, sexual activity, and just survival in general. We're going to talk a little bit about those hormones on the next page. Okay. I do want you to identify a couple things in this picture. Okay. So make sure you can highlight or identify, I should say. I'll start here on the left side and just go clockwise. The posterior pituitary, the infundibulum. It's just where you can just highlight the part that says primary plexus. That's fine. The hypothalamus, the hypophysioportal veins, the anterior pituitary, and the secondary plexus. Now, if you can't tell on the exam what's anterior and what's posterior, find those portal veins. If you find the portal veins, you know that this has to be the anterior pituitary. You know that this therefore has to be the posterior pituitary. All right, let's talk about the hormones a little bit more here on this next page. All right, between the two, the anterior pituitary is much larger. It actually comprises about 75% of the pituitary. It evolves anatomically up from the floor of the mouth. So it comes up from the floor of our mouth, whereas the posterior pituitary comes down from the brain. So they actually come from 2 opposite ends and then they meet in the middle. And that explains why they're so very, very different. Okay. I already talked about the first bullet there, but a blood capillary system connects the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary, enabling enabling bloodborne molecules to be carried from the hypothalamus directly to the anterior pituitary before they're diluted with blood in our larger vessels. The hormones released from the anterior pituitary flow into the general circulation for action in far parts of the body. They're either classified as those acting on non-endocrine target organs, like in the case of growth hormone and prolactin, or those acting on other endocrine glands like TSH, ACTH, LH and FSH, and I just abbreviated those so I didn't have to read them off. Okay. What you have here are very, very general descriptions of what these hormones do. Okay. As those who are taking physiology know, it gets a lot more detailed in that class because we did that here a few weeks ago. For this class, I keep it pretty simple. Okay. Growth hormone, abbreviated GH, which you'll sometimes see listed out as human growth hormone, which I think is pretty redundant. But it targets the liver, the adipose tissue, the soft tissues, and the bones of the body. Hence the name growth hormone. It promotes growth. It actually does so indirectly. It doesn't actually directly do that, but it promotes growth in a variety of ways. It also is going to help control protein, lipid, and carbohydrate metabolism. So not only does it help us grow, but it also helps us produce ATP. If you think of it that way, that's a kind of easy way to remember it. It produces energy. Prolactin. Think of prolactin as that it promotes lactation. If you don't know what lactation is, that's the release of milk from a breastfeeding mother and the delivery of that milk to the baby that needs it for nourishment. Prolactin, therefore, promotes lactation. It targets the mammary glands to stimulate the production of milk. Thyroid stimulating hormone, I mentioned that one a little bit ago, stimulates the release of the thyroid hormones from the thyroid gland. So it triggers the thyroid gland to release thyroid hormones. ACTH is short for adrenocorticotropic hormone, which is a very long named hormone. But if you break it down, there's kind of three parts to it. Adreno for adrenal, cortico for cortex, and that's what it targets. It tells the adrenal cortex to release certain hormones. Okay, and we'll talk about the adrenal cortex here in a few slides. Okay. The last two hormones, luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone, I essentially just describe them as hormones that help promote reproductive function. They are involved in both men and women. In women, it targets ovaries to help promote reproductive function. And in men, it targets testes to promote reproductive function. It does some very specific things that help with reproduction, but I'm not really going to get too caught up in the weeds on that because it is pretty technical physiology stuff, and that's not what this class is all about. Okay. As I was just describing on the previous page, the release of these hormones is regulated by the hypothalamus by way of those releasing and inhibiting hormones. For example, I say growth hormone, releasing hormone promotes the release of growth hormone, whereas growth hormone inhibiting hormone inhibits it. Okay. There are other hormones, prolactin releasing hormone promotes release of prolactin, for example, and so on and so forth. Okay. These 7 hormones from the hypothalamus, I want to mention them, but I'm not going to worry about you knowing them for the exam, and that's why you don't see them anywhere on this lecture, or in this lecture. Posterior pituitary gland, once again, is derived from a downgrowth of the brain. Key feature of it does not synthesize its own hormones. Okay, and that's because it is just an extension of the hypothalamus, as I said on the previous page. This illustration really should emphasize that. Okay. Within the hypothalamus and down into the posterior pituitary, we have neurons called neurosecretory cells. Okay. The cell bodies of these neurons are located back up in the thalamus or hypothalamus, excuse me. And then the axons from those cells project down into the posterior pituitary. So literally the posterior pituitary is just an extension of the hypothalamus. 2 important hormones are produced by the hypothalamus, but are stored and secreted by the posterior pituitary. So the hypothalamus makes them, posterior pituitary just holds on to them and then releases them when it's time. Okay. The hormones are produced up here, and then instead of an action potential propagating down the axons of those neurons, the hormones are transported down the axon to the axon terminals, to the tips of the branches at the end. Okay. And then those hormones are held until it's time to be released. What are those 2 hormones? Oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone. Oxytocin is a very important hormone in females during childbirth. because it increases the contractions of the uterus to force the baby downward. Okay, this explains why females, as they get closer and closer to delivering the baby, their contractions get stronger and stronger and stronger. They are producing more and more oxytocin, and that's causing the stronger contractions. Okay. The female is in the late stages of pregnancy, and they're wanting to give birth at that point in time. You can be induced. Induction involves a chemical called pertussin. I believe it's pertussin, if I remember correctly off the top of my head. But that's just synthetic oxytocin that just gets the ball rolling and starts pushing that baby down and out of the uterus. Okay. After birth, oxytocin plays a role in helping with prolactin. In this case, it helps with the secretion of milk. And then it's responsible for maternal instincts. Okay. So obviously, oxytocin is very involved in women, but thinking about women, are they always giving birth or are they always producing milk? No, not throughout their entire life. Okay, probably just a small segment of their life. They're breastfeeding and giving birth. Okay, so what does it do during those other periods of time? And what about men? Do men not produce oxytocin? Absolutely, men do. I'm just not really going to talk too much about that other stuff, and because it's just not 100% always known what those hormones or that hormone anyway does. Antidiuretic hormone is a hormone that does the opposite of what a diuretic does to us. If you don't know what a diuretic is, it's something that makes you pee a whole lot and therefore flushes the fluids of your body. A great example of that is alcohol, where the more alcohol you ingest, the more and more you pee, and therefore the more and more dehydrated you get. That's what causes a hangover. If you drink a bunch of alcohol, the next day you'll be secreting this antidiuretic hormone so that you'll conserve what water you still have. So in other words, it's going to help decrease urine production as well as sweat so that we are conserving our water levels. Another name for it is antidiuretic hormone, or excuse me, another name for antidiuretic hormone is vasopressin, which relates to what it does to your blood pressure. It makes it go up. And that's a process I didn't even describe, so I'm not going to really get into it. But that's where that term comes from. As far as this image, I don't really care about you knowing it. The one on the previous page was the one I wanted you to worry about for the thyroid or the hypothalamus and the pituitary. All right, moving on. Next organ that we're going to talk about is actually our largest endocrine gland. It is the thyroid, and it has an H shape, capital H, okay, or kind of like a butterfly shape, which is what I kind of think it looks like. Located just below the larynx, which is your voice box. There are two major lobes to it, a right and left lobe, and then they're connected by the isthmus. So like the right and left lobes are like the vertical parts of the H, and then the crossbar of the H is the isthmus, which runs right in front of your trachea. If we look at a couple of these images down at the bottom, we've got an anterior view showing you its kind of features. This is a anatomical picture, whereas over here, this is an actual cadaver thyroid, excuse me, and I really like this one because it really gives you that H shape to it, where you can see the right and left lobes very specifically, and the isthmus right there in front of the trachea really nicely. Okay. Now over here in our figure A, there's a third lobe that's labeled, what we call the pyramidal lobe, but notice we don't have it over here. Okay, if we look at these two pictures down at the bottom right of the page, here's a thyroid that's been removed from the throat of an individual, obviously after they've passed away. Over on the right is a posterior view of the thyroid, which gives us a view of the parathyroids, which we'll talk about here in a second. we see one of those pyramidal lobes here, this little projection there. This one also doesn't have the pyramidal lobe. So why is that? Well, about 50% of people have that third lobe, the pyramidal lobe. Not everybody, about half of the people have that, okay, which makes sense. Got 2 here, half of that is 50%. So we see 1 out of the 2. I guess it's 1 out of 3, but nonetheless. Okay. As far as this image goes on the top left, I do want you to highlight, it's just the 4 things that are bolded for you. So the pyramidal lobe, the right lobe, left lobe, isthmus. Now, once again, remember right and left for your individuals is not always your right and left. When looking at this picture, this is the right lobe, this is the left lobe. You know that is the case because this is the anterior view. So this is the right side of their neck. This is the left side of their neck, not your right and left. Okay. Your thyroid is composed of sacs called thyroid follicles. And on the inside of each of those follicle sacs is a protein-rich colloid. It's a really thick kind of fluid, okay, lined by a simple cuboidal epithelium of follicular cells. That's what we're showing in this figure down on the bottom left. Zoom in under a microscope at some of those follicular cells. And then on the inside, that sac-like structure is where you find the fluid called colloid. Fancier term for that is thyroglobulin. Okay. Those follicular cells are going to secrete the 2 major thyroid hormones, T3 and T4, which have much longer and fancier names. Triiodithyronine and tetraiodithyronine. You'll never ever have to pronounce or spell those, I promise you, not at least in this class. All you need to know them as are T3 and T4. Okay. Primary effect of these 2 hormones is the same thing, to increase our body's metabolic rate. So they speed up the chemical reactions. They also intensify them in your body. So they play a big role in production of energy. And they're also very involved with helping regulate your body temperature, which is something I'm not going to get into in this class. All you need to know is that they increase your metabolic rate. And you may have heard of people having like a thyroid disorder or like a thyroid condition. A lot of times you hear about people that are very overweight that have a thyroid condition. In that case, it would be what we call hypothyroidism, where they're not producing enough of those hormones, and therefore their metabolism is really slowed down, and that's why they are easy at gaining weight. It's really easy for them to gain weight. Okay. You may have heard of like somebody having a goiter, which is like where their throat is really engulfed. There's like a big old ball. I mean, it can be really, really big. A lot of times that happens when the thyroid like gets way too active, and it can be really kind of gruesome looking. Other cells of the thyroid, what we call parafollicular or C cells, produce a 3rd hormone, calcitonin. And based on its name, hopefully it's going to just elicit the thought of the hormone or of the chemical calcium. And that's great because that's what it actually is involved with. We produce it in response to what we call hypercalcemia, which is just a fancy term for high blood calcium levels. And what it's going to do is help lower our calcium. It does so by decreasing the activity of our osteoclasts and increasing the number and activity of our osteoblasts, which we've seen these cells before. We talked about them back when we talked about bones. We learned that osteoclasts with the C are the cells that carve out our bone. They break down bone and release the calcium into the blood. Osteoblasts do the opposite. They take calcium from the blood and make bone with it. Well, if our calcium levels are really high, we don't want to release more calcium into the blood. So we decrease that process, and we want to take that calcium out of the blood and make bone with it. And that's why we increase the number and activity of those osteoblasts. Okay. So that's the thyroid. On the back side of the thyroid are the 4 parathyroid glands, each of which is about the size of a pea. Okay, and they're nice and illustrated here in our figure on the right in the color green, just like a pea would be. There are 2 embedded in each of the right and left lobes, and they are named based on their position as either left superior, left inferior, right superior, right inferior. go ahead and highlight those 4 bolded things on the figure on the right. Excuse me. Pretty straightforward. In this case, this is the left side of the image, but we see over here left superior, left inferior, which is different than what we saw here, and that's because this is a posterior view. So this is actually their left side. This is also their right side, and that's why they're labeled as such. Okay. Parathyroid glands consist of 2 primary types of cells: oxyphil cells, which we won't really talk about because we don't really know what they do. The other cells are called principal or chief cells, which secrete the hormone parathyroid hormone. And if I ask you on the exam who secretes parathyroid hormone, and you don't answer the parathyroid glands, it's gonna really hurt my heart because this is the most straightforward named hormone in the body. Okay. Parathyroid hormone is released in response to hypocalcemia. We just said hypercalcemia is high blood calcium. What's hypocalcemia? Low. Okay. Hypo means low, hyper means high. Okay. In this case, we're going to do the opposite essentially as what we just did when we release calcitonin. This time we want to increase the number and activity of osteoclasts, which is going to help elevate bone resorption or bone breakdown so that we release that calcium in the blood to hopefully make it go up. So in other words, parathyroid hormone and calcitonin, those do the exact opposite of one another. Those are called antagonistic hormones. And the reason that we have hormones that do these things that are completely opposite of one another is so that we can really kind of fine tune and keep our calcium levels at a pretty, hopefully normal and a pretty set rate or a set value, I guess. I don't know what I'm saying. All right, the adrenal glands are the next organs we're going to talk about. And these 2 glands sit on top of your kidneys like a little top hat. There's a very similar situation here with the adrenal glands to what we saw with the pituitary. And by that, I mean there's 2 distinctly different parts to each adrenal gland, just like there were 2 different parts to the pituitary. Actually, I'm going to print this page off because I do want to color it in. Now, as you see down here at the bottom, they're labeled actually as suprarenal glands. I guess that's kind of the newer way to describe these glands. Supra, as we know, is superior. Anytime you see renal, okay, that's a direct giveaway that we're talking about the kidneys. So suprarenal refers to the fact that they're on top of the kidneys. I don't really know why they're trying to change the name, but I usually call them adrenal glands because that's the way I was taught. Okay. They're very small, only about 5 centimeters in length, weigh about 5 grams each. So it's very, very small. As I've already kind of alluded to, there's 2 embryonically and functionally different parts to each of them. Okay. So in other words, the left and the right aren't they're not different, but each one is made up of 2 different parts. Okay. And it's very similar to, like I said, with the anterior and the posterior pituitary. Those portions include an outer adrenal cortex and then an inner adrenal medulla. And I told you guys at the beginning of the semester when I first introduced the words cortex and medulla that your adrenal glands are made up of an adrenal cortex and an adrenal medulla. So hopefully you kind of remember that. Surrounding the entire organ is a capsule, which you can see it is labeled there. And that's what I'm gonna color here in our figure on the bottom right. So I'm gonna switch over to my document camera so that I can prepare the picture to be colored. I'm gonna color that capsule, this kind of nice greenish shade. Deep to that is the glomerulosa, which is the first of the 3 layers of the adrenal cortex. I'm gonna color it yellow. The middle part of the adrenal cortex, I'm gonna color orange, is the fasciculata. Some fun words to say here. And then the inner part of the adrenal cortex is the zona reticularis. And then finally, I'm going to color this one pink, is just the adrenal medulla. Now I'm going to color kind of quickly. I'm not going to color the entire image, just going to color part of it, but you can feel free absolutely to color the entire structure. It's a cross section, so we're cutting through so we can see the interior of it. The very thin outer part of this organ is the capsule. Okay, and if you were wanting to, you could also color all this on the outside, like so. Now you can see just deep to that is a very thin layer. That's the first layer of the cortex. Letter B is what we call the glomerulosa. You can see it very nicely there in yellow now. Okay, deep to that is the middle fasciculata. Good word to say. And then deep to that is the reticularis. Those are the 3 layers that make up the cortex. Okay. Now keep in mind, once again, that green outer capsule, that's not really a functioning part of the organ. It's just connective tissue, kind of just giving structure and support to the gland. Okay. But letters B, C, and D that I colored there, those are the 3 layers of the cortex. Okay. Each of those layers secretes a different set of hormones, what we collectively call the corticosteroids. I want to say there's like 20 or 25 hormones total. We're really just going to kind of focus in on a couple of them. And then the other part of the adrenal gland is all of this middle part, what we call the adrenal medulla. Okay. The adrenal medulla is kind of like the posterior pituitary in that it's kind of an extension of the nervous system. And I'll talk about that here in just a second. Okay, so nothing too crazy there, hopefully for identification. All right, let's talk about the 3 layers of the cortex, what we call the zona glomerulosa. We're going to start on the outside. That's the thin layer on the outside of the cortex, produces a set of hormones called mineralocorticoids. And that's because they affect mineral homeostasis. When we talk about the mineralocorticoids, the only one that you need to worry about is aldosterone. Okay, it's primarily going to function to maintain the homeostasis of our sodium and potassium levels in our blood, that is. Okay, so the minerals that they're regulating, or aldosterone is regulating, is sodium and potassium. Okay, it also adjusts your blood volume by controlling how much water we retain. Okay, and in doing so, that affects our blood pressure, and it also helps regulate our pH. So it's a pretty significant hormone with a lot of different things related to the blood. We won't really get into too much specifics about that. Nickname for aldosterone is the salt retaining hormone, which tells you exactly what it does. It helps us retain salt. So in other words, it makes you pee out less salt. Okay. The middle layer of the cortex secretes hormones collectively called glucocorticoids, which their name implies that they regulate glucose homeostasis, which is absolutely what they do. The only hormone that you need to worry about is cortisol. And like aldosterone, it has a nickname. It's called the stress hormone, and that's because it is released in response to stress. Okay, and stress is something you hear a lot about. People talk about stress. They're generally going to be describing like mental stress, like the stress of a class, like anatomy and physiology, and studying for it and staying on top of things. But stress can be just anything that impairs your ability to stay in balance. It could be just like staying outside when it's really cold. It could be when you're not getting enough nutrients in your diet. It could be where you're like exercising too much. It could be going up to high altitude. Whenever you are subject to stress, your body needs to fight off that stress in order to try to stay in balance. And in order to stay in balance, you need energy. That's how we are able to fight off stress. So this stress hormone cortisol helps us produce energy. So how does it do it? Well, it helps us break down our proteins into amino acids, which can be then changed into glucose in our liver. And this glucose can then be used to make ATP, energy. We also accelerate the mobilization of lipids. So we move lipids from adipose tissue or adipose cells to every cell in the body. And then we can use those lipids just like we use glucose to make energy. Cortisol assists in maintaining what we call vascular tone, which I'm not going to really talk about. Just mention it and go on. So cortisol is fantastic in short bursts. What we don't want is continual release of cortisol, because if it is released over a long period of time, it will actually shut down and suppress your immune system. It won't actually completely shut down the immune system, but it does make your body more susceptible to catching colds and getting sick. And that explains why, it's very common for students to come down with something when, it's like finals week and there's a lot on their plate between all their different classes. The final layer of the cortex reticularis secretes a set of hormones called androgens, which are sex steroids. And I'm not even really going to get into any more detail about that, just because there's not much to discuss. All right, the final part of the adrenal gland, once again, is the adrenal medulla, which, as I mentioned, is a lot like the posterior pituitary, and that it is neurosecretory in nature. It is composed of neurons adapted to secrete their products into the blood. Whenever the sympathetic nervous system is active, which if we think back just a couple weeks ago, we learned that sympathetic produces the fight or flight response. The medullary cells of this adrenal gland or the adrenal glands are going to secrete their hormones into the blood. And these hormones are called chromaffin cell, or these cells that secrete epinephrine and norepinephrine. The hormones are called chromaffin cells. Epinephrine, norepinephrine are two hormones released whenever that fight or flight response is active, and are going to trigger things like increases in heart rate, blood pressure, dilation of your pupils, bronchodilation, things that are going to enable you to either fight or flight, whether that's drastic like when you encounter a bear, or something simple like going for a light run, or just doing some form of physical activity. Now, you may have heard of the term epinephrine before. You probably have heard of like EpiPens. Okay, EpiPens are just medicine form of epinephrine that a person can keep in case of like extreme allergic reaction. Very common for people with like food allergies, like peanut allergies, have to carry an EpiPen around with them. You might know epinephrine as something we more commonly call adrenaline. That's what epinephrine is, adrenaline, which we all hear about, like adrenaline rushes. That adrenaline rush is just your fight or flight response. Okay. As far as the images, obviously the one I colored, I want you to know, and then I guess go ahead and highlight the two that are labeled here, right and left. Once again, you can see them listed as suprarenal. Make sure you also can describe them as adrenals as well. And same thing, this is the anterior view, so this is the right side, this is the left side. Nothing too crazy there. I would say between the pictures, it's probably more likely you'd see this one. All right, I'm going to stop here. We're going to pick up with the pancreas first thing next week. And we'll be able to breeze through that and finish the rest of the lecture pretty quickly, I think. Tuesday, we'll be able to actually get through everything before the class ends with relative ease. So I'll stop here and we'll call it a week.